In 1877, one family controlled more wealth than the United States Treasury itself. Their name was stamped on railroads that stretched across half the country, on steamships that crossed harbors, and on more Fifth Avenue mansions than any other family in New York. For a while, it genuinely looked like the Vanderbilts would rule America forever. 96 years later, in 1973, more than 100 of Cornelius Vanderbilt's descendants gathered for a family reunion. Not one of them was a millionaire. This is not a story about a stock market crash. No war destroyed this fortune. No government seized it. The money simply disappeared, spent, divided, and mismanaged by the very people who inherited it. And the strangest part is this: the seeds of that collapse were planted by the same man who built the fortune in the first place, decades before anyone thought to worry. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why one of history's greatest fortunes evaporated in 3 generations, and what it reveals about a pattern that shows up again and again in wealthy families all over the world. In 1810, a 16-year-old boy named Cornelius Vanderbilt borrowed $100 from his mother. He used it to buy a small boat and started ferrying passengers and freight around New York Harbor. It was unglamorous work, hauling cargo, rowing through bad weather, undercutting other boatmen who charged more for the same trip. Vanderbilt was not educated in any formal sense. He was not polished, not diplomatic, and not interested in being either. Contemporaries described him as blunt to the point of rudeness, occasionally vicious in negotiation, and almost impossible to outmaneuver in a business deal. But he understood something that almost none of his competitors did. Undercut prices until your rivals go broke, absorb their customers, then raise prices back up once you effectively own the route. He applied that formula first to small ferry routes, then to larger shipping lines, eventually earning the nickname Commodore for the size of his steamship operations. Later in life, already wealthy by the standards of his era, he pivoted again, this time into railroads, a newer and even more lucrative industry that was reshaping the American economy. He bought struggling rail lines, consolidated them, cut costs ruthlessly, and built out one of the most dominant railroad networks in the country, centered on the New York Central. By the time he died in 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt had accumulated a fortune of roughly $100 million. Adjusted for today's dollars, that figure is somewhere north of $200 billion, an amount so large that, at the time, it was close to half of everything held in the entire United States Treasury. He was, by almost any measure, one of the single greatest wealth builders in American history, self-made from a $100 loan. But greatness at building wealth is not automatically the same thing as greatness at protecting it long-term. And Cornelius made one decision: quiet, structural, almost invisible at the time, that would end up mattering more than any single business deal he ever closed. He put nearly all of that fortune into one place: railroad and shipping stock. Not land holdings outside his core industry, not manufacturing, not banking or diversified financial assets. One industry, one enormous concentrated bet, repeated over and over at massive scale. During his own lifetime, that concentration was actually his greatest strength. It's exactly what let him dominate so completely. He wasn't distracted managing a scattered portfolio. He was laser-focused on one empire and building it as large as humanly possible. But concentration is a double-edged tool. It builds fortunes fast. It also means that if the industry it's tied to ever weakens, there is nowhere else for that wealth to retreat to. Nobody worried about that risk in 1877. The railroads seemed unstoppable, woven into the permanent fabric of American industry. The family seemed just as untouchable. Cornelius reportedly told his son, the man who was about to inherit almost the entire fortune, that any fool can make a fortune. It takes real skill, he said, to hold on to one. His son was about to find out exactly how demanding that second part really was. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, almost his entire fortune went to a single person, his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt, known within the family simply as Billy. That concentration was deliberate. Cornelius believed wealth should stay consolidated, not fractured across too many hands. He had watched other prominent families splinter their fortunes by dividing them among many heirs, diluting both the money and the sense of responsibility for protecting it. He wanted none of that for his own legacy. So Billy inherited roughly 90% of everything, including an extraordinary 87% ownership stake in the New York Central Railroad. Billy had spent decades working in his father's shadow, managing pieces of the business, absorbing lessons the old man rarely bothered to explain out loud. When the fortune finally landed fully in his hands, he did something that almost nobody in Gilded Age high society expected from a second-generation heir. He grew it. Within roughly 8 years, Billy doubled the family fortune, pushing it past $200 million. He expanded the railroad network further, negotiated aggressively with rivals and regulators alike, and proved, at least for one generation, that a Vanderbilt heir could match his father's financial discipline, if not his raw entrepreneurial instinct. This was the absolute peak of Vanderbilt power. Their name sat on more railroad track than almost any family in the country. Their combined wealth was, by some contemporary estimates, comparable to the Treasury of a mid-sized nation. They funded universities, museums, and hospitals. Vanderbilt University in Nashville carries the family name specifically because of a $1 million gift Cornelius made late in his life, a gift Billy continued to support and expand. But peaks are deceptive by nature. From the summit, everything looks permanent and stable. It's only in hindsight that you can see which decisions, made quietly near the top, were actually setting up the eventual fall. Billy made one of those decisions near the end of his own life. Where his father had insisted on funneling almost the entire fortune into a single heir, Billy chose a different path. He divided his estate among several of his children, including his sons Cornelius II, William Kissam, and George Washington Vanderbilt. At the time, it looked like generosity, fairness even. Every son would receive a substantial share of the family's staggering wealth, rather than watching one brother inherit everything while the rest received comparatively little. But fairness and financial discipline are not the same thing, and they don't always pull in the same direction. Every division of a fortune is also, quietly, a division of urgency. When one person controls the entirety of a fortune, they feel the full weight of protecting it. Every decision carries the full consequence. When that fortune splits among several people, each controlling only a fraction, that weight becomes lighter for everyone involved. And when the weight of responsibility gets lighter, discipline often gets lighter right along with it. The third generation was about to demonstrate exactly how light that weight had become. The heirs of the third generation didn't grow up watching their grandfather claw his way up from a rented rowboat on New York Harbor. They grew up in mansions, with staff, with a family name that already opened every door in the country. And unlike Cornelius, who built an empire from nothing, or Billy, who successfully expanded one, this generation largely inherited something they had never personally had to fight for. Many of them treated it accordingly. Where earlier Vanderbilts had competed fiercely over railroad routes, shipping contracts, and market share, this generation redirected that same competitive instinct towards something with no productive return at all: social status. The turning point arrived in March of 1883. At that time, New York's high society was tightly controlled by one woman, Mrs. Caroline Astor, who, alongside her social gatekeeper Ward McAllister, maintained an exclusive list of exactly 400 acceptable families. the so-called 400. The Vanderbilts, despite their staggering wealth, were considered unacceptable outsiders, new money in Mrs. Astor's eyes, no matter how many hundreds of millions of dollars it represented. Alva Vanderbilt, wife of William Kissam Vanderbilt, decided to force the issue. She built an enormous chateau-style mansion, occupying an entire block of Fifth Avenue, and threw a costume ball to christen it, reportedly costing well over $250,000, worth many millions today. She invited journalists in ahead of time to preview the decorations, deliberately fueling anticipation across the city. Then she made one calculated move. She left Mrs. Astor's own daughter off the guest list. Astor's daughter had been practicing dance routines for the ball, along with her friends, expecting an invitation that never arrived. To fix the oversight, Mrs. Astor herself was forced to pay a formal social call on Alva Vanderbilt, the exact gesture of acknowledgement Alva had been maneuvering to obtain. The invitation followed immediately. Astor and her daughter attended the ball. The Vanderbilts had officially arrived. It's a small story, almost a footnote in a much larger family history, but it marks something important. From this point forward, a significant amount of Vanderbilt energy and Vanderbilt money poured not into building anything new, but into competing for status the family had, in financial terms, already earned twice over. That competition escalated fast. Newport, Rhode Island became a stage for it. The Breakers, a 70-room summer cottage built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, was less a home than a monument, designed explicitly to outshine what rival Vanderbilts and rival Gilded Age families had already built nearby. Along Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, the family eventually filled entire blocks with mansions, several branches of the same family effectively competing against each other to build the most impressive residence in New York. Perhaps the clearest single example of status replacing strategy involves Alva's daughter, Consuelo Vanderbilt. Alva arranged her daughter's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough, a British aristocrat, reportedly in exchange for roughly $2.5 million in railroad stock, worth close to $100 million today, plus an ongoing annual payment on top of that. The marriage bought the family a noble title. It generated no return, produced no new income, and by most accounts, made both parties involved deeply unhappy for years. It was wealth spent not to build anything, but to purchase status the family, strictly financially, no longer even needed. Multiply that pattern across dozens of heirs and several decades, and the math turns brutal. Grand houses require armies of staff and constant upkeep. Estates carry enormous fixed costs, whether or not family income is still growing to match them. And unlike Cornelius, who kept building new sources of income throughout his life, this generation was overwhelmingly focused on spending what previous generations had already built, rather than expanding it further. Not every third-generation Vanderbilt fit this pattern of pure excess. Cornelius Vanderbilt II directed large sums toward the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Yale, and Columbia's Medical College. Genuine philanthropy rather than simple indulgence. But philanthropy, however admirable, is still money leaving the family's productive capital base, permanently, generation after generation, with nothing flowing back in to replace it. Meanwhile, some heirs pursued personal ruin far more directly. Reginald Reggie Vanderbilt, a great-grandson of the Commodore, became known primarily as a gambler and a playboy, burning through his share of the inheritance at a pace that alarmed even his own family. He would later become the father of fashion designer Gloria Vanderbilt and grandfather to journalist Anderson Cooper, who has said publicly that his own mother made clear there would be no trust fund waiting for him. 3 generations after Reggie, that statement alone tells you almost everything about where the money went. Then structural pressure arrived from outside the family entirely. the railroad industry itself began to change. Freight and passenger business that had once seemed permanently unshakable started losing ground, first to competing rail lines, later to trucks, buses, and eventually commercial airplanes. Between the mid-1940s and late 1950s alone, the family's core railroad dropped several of its daily passenger routes between New York and Chicago as demand kept eroding. Revenue the family had long assumed would simply keep flowing forever began to shrink instead. And remember, the fortune was still structured almost exactly the way Cornelius had originally built it, concentrated overwhelmingly in railroads. The lack of diversification that had been irrelevant while the railroads were unstoppable was now a serious liability, because the railroads were no longer unstoppable at all. By the time the Great Depression hit, some Vanderbilts were struggling badly enough that they opened their own private estates to public tourists, simply to generate enough income to maintain them. A family that once treated a mansion as a private trophy was now selling admission tickets to see it. Estate taxes took another bite out of what remained with each generation that passed. There were no family trusts coordinating decisions, no unified governance structure, no shared strategy protecting the fortune as a whole. Each heir managed or mismanaged their own individual slice, independently, often competitively, almost never cooperatively. By 1947, every single Vanderbilt-owned mansion in New York City had been demolished. And in 1973, when more than 100 descendants of Cornelius Vanderbilt gathered for a family reunion, not one of them was a millionaire. The family that had once held wealth comparable to nearly half the entire United States Treasury had, within roughly 3 generations, arrived back at zero. So what actually happened here? It wasn't one catastrophic decision. It was a slow accumulation of very human, very predictable behaviors. The same behaviors that show up in wealthy family after wealthy family, across cultures and centuries, whenever a fortune moves from the person who built it to the people who simply received it. First, concentration risk, inherited unchanged. Cornelius built his fortune by betting almost everything on one industry at one moment in history when that bet was clearly right. That worked brilliantly while he was alive to steer it personally. But no one in later generations was ever forced to reconsider that same concentrated bet as the world around it changed. The exact strategy that built the empire was never updated to protect it once conditions shifted. Second, the dilution effect. Every time a fortune splits across more heirs, the personal incentive to protect it carefully, urgently, individually, gets weaker for each person now holding only a fraction of the original whole. 10 people mildly caring about a shared fortune often end up protecting it far worse than one person who feels its entire weight resting on their own decisions alone. Third, and probably the most important, skill did not transfer along with the money. Cornelius Vanderbilt possessed something that no inheritance can pass down directly: the instinct, discipline, and sheer hunger of a person who built enormous wealth from absolutely nothing. His descendants inherited the money itself in full. They did not automatically inherit the mindset that had originally created it. Growing up already at the very top removes exactly the kind of pressure and necessity that forged that mindset in the first generation. It's worth noting this pattern isn't universal. Some families in the exact same era managed to avoid it. The Rockefellers, who built a comparably enormous fortune around the same decades, put far more emphasis on formal family governance, regular family meetings, shared investment oversight, and deliberately instilling financial responsibility in each new generation, rather than assuming it would simply appear on its own. That family's wealth, while also diminished proportionally over a century of division among a growing number of descendants, never collapsed anywhere near as completely or as visibly as the Vanderbilt fortune did. The difference wasn't the size of the initial fortune. Both families started from genuinely staggering wealth. The difference was structure. whether anyone in later generations built systems to compensate for the fact that money alone doesn't teach the discipline required to keep it. This is why some version of the same proverb, "Wealth doesn't survive past the third generation," shows up independently in cultures all over the world, under completely different names, describing the exact same underlying pattern. It was never really about the money itself. It's about what money quietly removes once it's already there in abundance. Necessity, urgency, and the specific discomfort that tends to force discipline in the first place. The Vanderbilts didn't lose their fortune because the world turned decisively against them. They lost it because, generation after generation, nothing in their world demanded that they hold on to it. Cornelius Vanderbilt once told his son that any fool can make a fortune, but that it takes real skill to hold on to one. His own family would go on to prove him right, generation after generation, in exactly the way he likely feared, but never lived to see in full. The Vanderbilts weren't the only dynasty to learn that lesson the hard way. And they weren't the only family to face this exact fork in the road. In our next episode, we'll look at a family that faced the identical fork and chose the opposite direction entirely. We'll find out exactly what they did differently, and whether it's a lesson any family, at any scale of wealth, can actually apply.